so much to the Diocese of Grand Rapids, Calvin Persian Initiative, and all the coordinators of this conference for this opportunity to be with you virtually today. It's really my honor and privilege. When I first met Trisha, gosh, I don't even know how long ago it was now, but she shared with me about this collaborative initiative led by men who are incarcerated, who were determined to engage this deep and difficult work of restorative justice and proclaim its message with their neighbors beyond prison walls. Eric, your brothers inside, words don't contain my admiration for your resilience and resolve. Your example is a shining light, not only here in Grand Rapids, but across the country. And so, with your leadership at the helm, and no doubt decades of experience in prison ministry and criminal justice reform already in the room, I feel it's only fair to share a little bit about how I arrive in this work. I'm often brought back to 2010 when serving as a caseworker in a homeless shelter for families. I recall my client Valerie, who became unhoused when the woman that she was living with attempted to take custody of her 3-year-old daughter, and Valerie refused. While accompanying Valerie, I learned that her biological father was in prison, and she had found her own mother beaten to death as a teenager. She had endured more abuses and discrimination in her lifetime than any one person should have to bear. So naturally, I was horrified when I learned that she had been arrested during a routine trip to the DMV for an outstanding warrant that turned out to be a false accusation. Time and time again, Valerie had not only been failed by, but further victimized by the very people and systems that were supposed to protect her. This was my first glimpse into how cycles of poverty were knotted up with cycles of incarceration, and what I can now identify as cycles of unhealed trauma. Prior to this, I was a child in the 90s, inundated with nightly news accounts of executions. And when asking authority figures, including my parents and faith leaders around me, how killing someone or locking them up fixes the wrong that they committed, I was met time and time again with, that's just the way it is. Fast forward to 2011, when I was taking a parish course on Catholic social teaching and learned about restorative justice, a response to harm and violence that seeks to heal and repair the people and relationships violated by crime. This seemed so in line with core gospel values that I'd been taught. So why had I never heard about it before in all of my years of ministry and church involvement? This is why I consider a vocational calling to educate, advocate within and through the lens of my Catholic faith identity in institutions for the transformation of our criminal legal system. I am neither formally incarcerated nor a victim of violent crime, but I am in sacred relationship with those who are. What's more, I believe we all know what it is to suffer and cause harm to others. I am a fervent believer in the profound interconnection of all God's creation and mutual responsibility for one another's woundedness and healing alike. I take seriously the role of community in transforming systems that dehumanize. After over a dozen years in ministry leadership, I am convicted that people of faith have a unique mandate to boldly proclaim that there is a better way. And so I join you today as Director of Restorative Justice at Catholic Mobilizing Network. CMN is the national Catholic organization working to end the death penalty and promote restorative justice. Founded in 2009 in response to a national campaign by the US Conference of Catholic Bishops to end the use of the death penalty. CMN's founders included murder victim family members, death row exonerees, women religious, clergy, and lay leaders, all of whom knew that we must not only abolish this most violent practice, but also build up reconciling ones. They saw that restorative justice offered an antidote to the culture of vengeance and racial bias that permeates our legal system. 13 years later, this dual purpose continues to chart paths of renewed encounter and systemic transformation. Now, praise God that Michigan hasn't had the death penalty since 1963. Well done. And thankfully, the country is slowly but surely moving in Michigan's direction, trending away from the use of capital punishment. 26 states have either abolished the practice or are currently operating under a governor-declared moratorium. However, the continued use of the death penalty is an affront to the sanctity of human life for all involved: those executed, victim survivors, families, correctional and legal actors, and the community at large. To challenge the death penalty is to question the retributive values and racist legacy that underlie its roots, its use. For this reason, Catholic Mobilizing Network engages the topic of restorative justice, primarily in the context of the criminal legal system. But we know that the need for healing and transformation is not isolated there. This is the season of Easter. Christ's life, death, and resurrection implore us to be ministers and messengers of reconciliation. But the pursuit of God's vision is neither simple nor easy. How desperately we need methods of encounter shaped by values of human dignity, solidarity, and racial equity in all aspects of life. Restorative justice offers us practices that balance mercy with truth in pursuit of justice that meets the needs of all those impacted by the harm at hand. This has implications for not only our legal system, but our personal lives, churches, and communities. So journey with me as we imagine the possibilities. Sometimes I think it can be helpful to remember the original meaning of justice. The USCCB's 2018 Pastoral Letter Against Racism, Open Wide Our Hearts, reminds us that this is the original meaning of justice, where we are in right relationship with God, one another, and all of God's creation. Harm, crime, and oppression shatter this divine vision for wholeness, violating human dignity and relationships. In response, restorative justice aims to repair relationships and attend to the needs of all involved in a healing way. Pope Francis puts it this way in his most recent social encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. Justice is properly sought out of love of justice itself, out of respect for the victims, as a means of preventing new crimes and protecting the common good, not as an alleged outlet for personal anger. Before we go further, I invite you to take a moment in reflection. Think back over the last week or month, maybe year. Consider a time that you felt wronged or hurt by someone. What happened? How were you impacted? Emotionally, physically, spiritually? How do you think others were impacted, including the person who wronged you? What did you need in that moment or in the aftermath? What would healing look or feel like to you? When you're ready, I invite you to turn to someone near you, gaze toward them, and offer a gesture of compassion as we recall these memories. Often when I ask these questions about what did you need with a small group, I hear responses like to be heard and believed, answers about why me, consolation, a guarantee of safety, acknowledgement, or apology. In so many ways, these are universal human needs that our present legal system simply wasn't designed to meet, focused instead on what law was broken, who's guilty, and what should their punishment be. So I want to share a story with you. When dreaming of a world where restorative justice is the norm, I think of our friends, the Gromer and McBride families. Perhaps some of you were even here years past when they spoke. In 2010, Anne Gromer was shot and killed by her boyfriend Connor and later died of her injuries. Anne's parents, Kate and Deacon Andy Gromer, in seminary at the time, forgave Connor almost immediately and moved mountains to advocate for a facilitated restorative justice sentencing circle that took their needs and desires for honoring Anne's memories into account. In the circle, could answer. Far from being soft on crime, Connor attests that taking full responsibility for his actions and facing the impacts of them in this way was far more difficult than sitting in his cell. I know that many of you in this room are working to expand access and remove barriers to just these kinds of dialogues. God willing, I pray that only a few of us will ever need to participate in such a conversation because of violent crime. But there are a multitude of ways to engage with these approaches that strengthen bonds, heal wounds, and prevent future harms from taking place. What's more, it's stories like these that remind me how labels of victim and offender are vastly inadequate in acknowledging the fullness of our God-given dignity. The crucified Christ embodies this. Though without fault, he took the world's sinfulness upon himself on the cross. By this transcendent fusion of identities, Jesus' death and resurrection shattered the barriers artificially erected between us in order that we may enter into a new state of shared dignity, wholeness, and hope for new life together. Jesus sacrificed himself not to excuse us from facing the truth of our wrongdoing, but to model it. So then this begs the question, what is demanded of us when we cause harm to others? I'll add to the conversation what Richard Rohr so eloquently says. Suffering that is not transformed will most assuredly be transmitted. We are wounded people walking through a wounded world. Even when we're doing our best, we mess up. As a parent, I can comfortably and confidently say that I stand in this reality daily. I absolutely lose my cool sometimes. And it's not separate from the violence of the world around us. My 5-year-old is in preschool. You might even hear him upstairs. And he's picking up on gunplay that I struggle with given my work and people I know who have been affected by gun violence. So when I arrived home from work one day to be met with a finger gun, only 2 days after our neighbor's 22-year-old son was shot to death just down the street, let's just say my reaction was not something I'm proud of. I am grateful to my husband for his ability to step in so that I could step away, cry, cool down, and come back to make amends with my son. Life in relationship is messy. If not for learning about restorative justice, I might have opted to avoid or deny my behavior and its underlying causes. Instead, I try to understand and take responsibility for my actions. In this case, that looked like apologizing to my child, explaining to him that pretend guns make me feel sad and afraid, acknowledge how my outburst upset him, and ask if he'd like a hug or to play together. I should add that it also included allowing myself the time to grieve the loss of a life gone too soon, visit with and pray with my neighbor. At Catholic Mobilizing Network, we believe that justice demands an understanding of accountability broader than punishment can offer. This includes honest acknowledgement with oneself and others about the harms we have caused and their impacts. Standing in my Catholic tradition, I know that confession is imperative to the sacrament of reconciliation in our relationship with God. Likewise, the deep work of taking responsibility, expressing remorse, making amends, committing to never create that harm again, honors the dignity of the person who created the harm, and contributes to the healing of all those impacted. But let's be clear, accountability is not limited to individuals who enact direct harm or violence. As siblings in Christ, we are responsible for one another. And in the wake of harm and in the midst of oppression, we must ask ourselves, how am I impacted by, complicit in, or actively, even if unknowingly, contributing to this suffering? There are two parishes in Chicago who encapsulate this ongoing discernment. A number of years ago, Old St. Pat's Parish, a predominantly white upper middle class parish in the suburbs of Chicago, undertook a learning curriculum on racism. In the process, they examined together how, as individuals and an institution, they had internalized racist attitudes and engaged in reflection, dialogue, and action to move in a new direction. In the process, they formed a relationship with St. Agatha's, a historically African American parish on the south side of Chicago, who were already engaged in the work of healing and restorative justice in their neighborhood. Over time, the parishes began hosting monthly courageous conversations on race, where they gather for a meal and peacemaking circles, exploring harms, needs, and responsibilities to end racism as one human family. It is one of the great blessings of my job to hold peacemaking circles, a foundational restorative practice, with ministry leaders throughout the country. Often, these are people like yourselves, longing for connection and healing amidst division and open wounds in their families, parishes, ministries, and communities. When coming together, either virtually or in person, we pass a talking piece to signal the speaker, to whom, without interruption or reply, we simply listen, bearing witness to the stories that sing from within our deepest selves. Most often, we're not trying to repair a breach or resolve a conflict. We're asking simple questions like, where do you find a sense of belonging? Or what are you carrying that feels heavy? Julianne Stantz writes, sharing our soul story is a gift both for the storyteller and the listener. For it is in the sharing of our stories that communal bonds are strengthened, relationships are deepened, faith is nourished, and God's movement in our lives is revealed. And my, how God moves. From each circle, we come away encouraged, connected, and with clearer vision for a way forward than when we arrived. This work of strengthening community bonds is integral to building a culture of restorative justice. Because when relationships are strengthened, they become both harder to damage and easier to repair. Whether in the aftermath of crime, holding difficult conversations, or building community, restorative practices become a container for the Holy Spirit to move, vessels for God's mercy and grace to shape the labor of justice itself. Before I wrap up and we move into questions, I want to offer a few tools to accompany you in the journey. Tricia has some handouts with more information about each of these. The first is Catholic Mobilizing Network's faith formation guide called Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity, which I know the guys are reading inside right now. This little book is designed for individuals and groups to reflect together on these themes through prayer, stories, and discussion questions. For those who are eager to implement restorative practices, I'd commend you to Catholic Mobilizing Network's Paths of Renewed Encounter. And this is, I don't know if it's on the screen. And this is a restorative justice engagement guide intended for Catholic communities, but applicable to faith-based communities of any kind. And it's available both in print and digitally on our website at catholicsmobilizing.org. I'd also welcome you to tune in to our Encounters with Dignity podcast, which brings stories, learnings, and actionable wisdom from people who are doing and living restorative justice in their communities. And finally, if you're looking for experiential learning opportunities to go deeper, visit our website for more information about Intro to Restorative Justice workshops and our Restorative Justice Ministry community of practice. Mother Teresa said, if we have no peace, it's because we have forgotten that we belong to one another. In order to overcome division, demonization, and the temptation for revenge, we need processes that facilitate the remembering of our belonging to one another. Methods of encounter that have the capacity to hold complexity, deep wounds, generations of trauma, alongside hope, resilience, and prophetic imagination. Restorative justice practices offer such a container. If we commit to undertaking them, probably stumbling over ourselves and each other along the way, we might just tap into the memory of our birthright, bearing witness to God's image and likeness in one another and ourselves. May it be so. Thank you. I can't hear the room at the moment, but I think we have a little bit of time for questions if there are any. Oh, I can hear the room now.
I will. I will grab you a mic a minute and bring that to you. So we do have a couple questions. Hold on one second.
You wanted to say something about capital science.
I could hear it, but it was very echoey. I now can't hear the room.
All right, Caitlin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted you to say something more about capital punishment. And that's all Rich said. Are there any other questions? Let's give her a couple maybe at once because of that.
And if there's, I know there are a lot of directions to go. If there's any more
Okay, I have a
particulars to the capital punishment question, that'll help me direct my remarks.
Can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Okay. In the Michigan Department of Corrections, there are hundreds upon hundreds of mentally ill inmates who are incarcerated. And there is really no help in the MDOC regarding these mentally ill inmates. And often what happens is because they're mentally ill, they're either just simply drugged up or if they, you know, if they argue, disagree with a guard, they wind up getting a ticket. A ticket might be in the form of failure to comply to administrative rules or something of that nature, which means an instant flop, which means they're going to, when they see the parole board, they're just going to spend more time in prison because they're non-compliant, but yet they're mentally ill and they're not being helped. So now, what is being done or can be done to help the mentally ill inmates? Because in the state of Michigan, there's nothing, at least that I'm aware of right now. These therapy groups really don't amount to much when it comes to, the mentally ill. Their mentally ill concerns are really not being addressed. So regarding restorative justice and looking at these individuals as human beings and trying to help them, what can we do, or what is actually being done at this point?
you. Should I go ahead and respond, or do we want to take a couple more? Or I can go ahead and say just a few words, which is that, and my first response is that I think restorative justice is one aspect and framework for how we think about the way that we go about transforming our legal system, and it gives us a particular set of tools for repairing relationships. But this is not a singular cure-all solution, right? We also need individualized services and supports for those folks who are struggling with mental illness. We need to make sure that they have access to the kind of, physical, emotional supports that will help them journey with those diagnoses that they're working through. What I also know is that there is a great deal of mental illness that's attributed back to unhealed childhood trauma. And that what I think the restorative justice framework and practices offer are spaces for really intentionally working through some of that trauma in relationship with others who have endured similar ones. So whether that's victim support service or circles and parishes, or I know of a number of circle spaces inside of prisons that are really intentionally focused on how do we examine the traumas and harms and suffering that brought me to this place of committing this harm in a way that allows me to both have grace and forgiveness with the people that caused those harms to me, and have grace and forgiveness within myself so that I can move forward in a different way. And that is, I think, can go hand in hand with really skilled trauma-informed mental health support. So that's just a few thoughts, but I encourage and commend the work that it sounds like you're already locally involved in to try to make those supports more accessible and available inside. And I don't want to disregard the capital punishment question. I just realized it's a big question, right? So I guess in short, what I can kind of say is that the Catholic Catechism states that the death penalty is inadmissible in all cases. This is because in modern society, we have other means of holding people accountable and keeping society safe. We do not need to resort to taking a human life. And what we know, and there's a really powerful prayer video from Pope Francis that I can send Trisha to send around, where Pope Francis says it, and we know it from our relationships that in many ways in U.S. society we've been fed a narrative that killing someone brings a victim or their family closure and healing. And what we hear time and time again is that it does not. And if anything, the appeals processes and just drawn out nature of it just reignites that pain in very public ways time and time again. And so we work closely with murder victim family members who say, "Not in my name," and are really adamant that this is not the way we should be proceeding in our country. And so I know there's so much more to be said there. And if you have a particular question or want to talk with some of my colleagues who do work on that work more specifically, I'd be happy to put you in touch. And there's lots on our website as well. Not sure we are on time. I can see Trisha, so I'll defer to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Do you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you so much for your time with us together. Again, Caitlin was the facilitator for my first ever peacemaking circle training, and I'm so grateful to know her and to love her and to serve with her, and just everybody that you encounter, Caitlin, is touched and better for that encounter. And just thank you. Thank you for your ministry and what you do and your willingness to be with us live, if not in person. person. Someday soon, hopefully, we hope to get you here with us as well.